The date was May 14th, 2026, but the fuse had been burning for decades. For 40 years, the conflict between Israel and Iran had been defined by what military analysts called the shadow war. It was a conflict of proxies, cyber attacks, and whispered assassinations, a game played in the dark alleys of Beirut, the shipping lanes of the Arabian Sea, and the digital nodes of the global web. But the shadow war thrives only so long as there is ambiguity. On this Tuesday, the ambiguity evaporated. Intelligence reports from the Mossad and the CIA, verified through high-resolution satellite imagery, confirmed a nightmare scenario. At the Fordo fuel enrichment plant, buried deep beneath a mountain of solid granite near Qom, Iran had achieved the impossible. They had reached 90.3% enrichment of uranium-235. In the parlance of nuclear physics, this is weapon grade. Iran was no longer a threshold state. They were a breakout state. The breakout time had dropped from weeks to hours. In Jerusalem, the decision was made in a windowless room beneath the Kiryat. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his war cabinet faced a binary choice: accept a nuclear-armed Iran or strike a target. Fordo was designed to withstand a direct hit from an American GBU-57 bunker buster. To hit it, Israel would need more than just gravity bombs. They would need a miracle of engineering and a gamble. At 02:15 local time, the miracle took flight. 4 F-35I Adir stealth fighters lifted off from Nevatim Air Base. They carried no external fuel tanks to preserve their stealth signature. Their targets were the S-400 missile batteries. Using an undisclosed suite of Israeli-made electronic warfare pods, the Adirs blinded the Iranian radar, creating a corridor of silence. Behind them came a second wave, F-15I Rams, carrying the ROKS standoff missile, a supersonic two-stage penetrator designed specifically for high-value hardened targets. The strike was surgical. The ROKS missiles didn't try to collapse the mountain. They targeted the ventilation shafts and the high-voltage transformers. In 10 minutes of fire and screaming jet engines, the Fordo enrichment cycle was shattered. The centrifuges, spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, suffered a catastrophic resonant failure. Iran's nuclear dream was in ruins, but the nightmare for the rest of the world was just beginning. The supreme leader, speaking from a secure bunker, issued a single-word command to the Revolutionary Guard: Atechesh, fire. Tehran did not petition the United Nations. They did not wait for diplomatic cover. At 21 hours on May 14th, the Zagros Mountains appeared to catch fire. This was the Great Saturation, the largest coordinated ballistic missile strike in human history. Over 400 missiles were launched in 3 distinct waves. The first wave consisted of the Fattah 110, a short-range solid-fueled missile known for its accuracy. The second wave saw the launch of the Kheibar Shekan, a medium-range beast with a maneuverable re-entry vehicle designed to evade interceptors. The final wave was the Fattah, Iran's vaunted hypersonic missile, capable of unpredictable flight paths at 5 times the speed of sound. As the launch signatures were picked up by U.S. Space Force SBIR's satellites, the red color sirens began to wail across Israel. From the Galilee to the Eilat, millions of people retreated to bomb shelters. Above them, the most sophisticated air defense network ever built prepared for its final exam. This was no longer about intercepting a few stray rockets from Gaza. This was a battle of pure physics. The Iron Dome handled the lower-tier threats. David's sling targeted the mid-range cruise missiles, and the Arrow 3 reached into the vacuum of space to meet the ballistic warheads before they could even begin their descent. The sky over Jerusalem looked like a digital simulation. Dozens of interceptors arced upward, leaving white trails that crisscrossed the black void. Each Arrow interceptor cost $3 million. Each Kheibar warhead cost a fraction of that. The math was tilted in Tehran's favor. For the first 2 hours, the defense held. The kill ratio was an astounding 94%. But saturation is a tactic of exhaustion. Every interceptor launched was one less in the magazine. By midnight, the magazine was running dry. The Fattah hypersonic warheads began their terminal phase, moving too fast for traditional radar to maintain a lock. They skipped off the upper atmosphere like stones on a pond when warheads struck the perimeter of the Nevatim Air Base, the very home of the F-35s that had struck Fordo. Another hit the Haifa petrochemical complex, sending a pillar of black smoke 2,000 feet into the air. In the North Arabian Sea, the U.S. Navy's Aegis destroyers joined the fight. The USS Roosevelt launched SM-3 Block 2IA interceptors, hitting Iranian warheads at their apogee, 200 miles above the Earth. It was a ballet of destruction, but it wasn't enough. 22 warheads impacted sovereign Israeli soil. The casualties were in the hundreds, but the strategic damage was worse. Israel's northern port was paralyzed, and the Nevatim runway was cratered. The shadow war was over. Total war had arrived, and the United States, despite its best efforts to pivot to the Pacific, was being pulled back into the furnace of the Middle East. The White House response was swift and lacked the traditional diplomatic off-ramps. At 6 hours on May 15th, President Trump, speaking from the Roosevelt Room, declared a national strategic emergency. The United States was no longer acting as a mediator. It was acting as the enforcer of global energy security. He announced Operation Midnight Sun. The goal was not an invasion of Iran. Washington had no appetite for another ground war, but rather the total commercial and military strangulation of the Islamic Republic. The centerpiece of this strategy was the Steel Curtain. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, led by the nuclear-powered supercarrier USS Abraham Lincoln, moved to within strike range of the Iranian coast, accompanied by 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser. The Lincoln established a total exclusion zone. The order was absolute. The Strait of Hormuz was closed to all Iranian traffic. Any vessel carrying Iranian crude or any ship attempting to deliver military hardware to Bandar Abbas would be boarded and seized. If they resisted, they would be neutralized. For the global economy, the Steel Curtain was a heart attack. 21% of the world's petroleum passes through the Strait of Hormuz. In the trading pits of London and New York, the price of oil didn't just rise. It gapped. It went from $85 a barrel to $140 in a single trading session. The America First policy was being put to the ultimate test. Could the U.S. protect the global supply chain without starting World War III? The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy, IRGC-N, did not blink. They viewed the Steel Curtain as an act of war. Rear Admiral Alireza Tangsiri, commander of the IRGC Navy, announced that the Persian Gulf would become a cemetery for the arrogant powers. He deployed the Mosquito fleet, thousands of small, fast, highly maneuverable boats, many of them unmanned, hidden in the jagged coves of the Iranian coastline. The Lincoln's Combat Information Center, CIC, was a hive of activity. The Aegis baseline 10 radar system was tracking over 500 surface contacts. Simultaneously, these weren't warships. They were fiberglass speedboats equipped with Italian-made engines and Chinese-made anti-ship missiles. They moved in swarms, designed to overwhelm a destroyer's 5-inch guns and phalanx cannons through sheer numbers. As the sun set on May 15th, the first engagement began. A U.S. Navy MH-60R Seahawk helicopter, patrolling the inner strait, was fired upon by a shoulder-mounted manpads from an Iranian dhow. The Seahawk returned fire with Hellfire missiles, sinking the dhow in seconds. It was the first kinetic exchange between U.S. and Iranian forces in the 2026 conflict. The Steel Curtain was no longer a diplomatic threat. It was a wall of fire. The world held its breath as the Mosquito fleet began to move out of the coves and into the deep water of the shipping lanes. By 02:07 hours on May 16th, the Strait of Hormuz had become the most dangerous body of water on the planet. The IRGC had shifted from direct confrontation to a strategy of denial. They didn't need to sink the USS Abraham Lincoln to win. They just needed to make the strait uninsurable. They began the sowing. Under the cover of darkness, Iranian Mahdi-class stealth boats, small vessels with a radar, cross-section no larger than a jet ski, began dropping EM-52, rising mines across the narrowest part of the strait. These mines were not the static orbs of World War II. They were acoustic homing, rocket-propelled, weapons that sat on the seafloor and waited for the specific sound, signature of a supertanker, before launching upward to strike the hull. The U.S. Navy responded with surgical suppression, 2 EA-18G. Growlers flying from the deck of the Lincoln flooded the Iranian coastline with high-intensity broadband jamming. They weren't just blinding radar, they were frying the guidance links of the Iranian drones. But the Mosquito fleet was using optical guidance, human eyes and cameras, which no jammer could stop. At 04:15, the disaster that everyone feared finally occurred. The Pacific Glory, a 300,000-ton, very large crude carrier, VLCC, flying the flag of Panama but owned by a Chinese state-linked conglomerate, was transiting the eastern lane. Despite U.S. warnings to heave to, the captain, under pressure from Beijing to deliver his cargo, maintained his course. A swarm of 6 Iranian fast boats converged on the tanker. They didn't sink it. They fired RPG-29s into the bridge and the engine room. As the Pacific Glory drifted, dead in the water, it drifted over an EM-52 mine. The explosion was gargantuan. The mine struck the midsection, rupturing the double hull. 2 million barrels of Saudi Arabian crude began to bleed into the emerald waters of the Gulf. It was an ecological and economic catastrophe. But more importantly, it was a geopolitical tripwire. Beijing's reaction was instantaneous. The Chinese Ministry of Defense announced that their interests were being unacceptably compromised by American-led destabilization. They ordered Task Force 175, led by the Type 055 destroyer, Nanjang, to move from the Gulf of Aden toward the strait. Suddenly, the U.S. Fifth Fleet was caught in a pincer. To their north was the Iranian Mosquito fleet and its land-based missile batteries. To their south was a Chinese battle group demanding neutrality for their tankers. In the Lincoln's CIC, the tension was palpable. The steel curtain was being challenged not just by a regional power, but by a global peer. The American destroyers, their VLS, vertical launch system, cells already half empty from intercepting Iranian missiles, were now being shadowed by Chinese radar. The blockade was no longer about Iran. It was about who controlled the flow of the world's lifeblood. The 15-minute clock of the conflict was nearing its end, and the freefall had begun. The final act of the 48-hour escalation saw the United States shift from containment to decapitation, with the Strait of Hormuz paralyzed, and the Chinese Navy closing in. Washington decided to remove Iran's ability to wage war entirely. At 2300 hours on May 16th, the ghost of Diego Garcia took flight. For the first time in history, the B-21, Raider, the U.S. Air Force's next-generation flying-wing stealth bomber, was entering combat, operating in a dark configuration with 0 electronic emissions. 2 raiders crossed the Iranian coastline at 50,000 feet. They were invisible to the S-400, batteries that the Israelis had only temporarily blinded. Their target was Eagle 44, the IRGC's underground airbase built into the mountains of the Hormuz province. This facility housed the Iranian Su-35s and the command and control for the Mosquito fleet. The B-21s didn't use traditional explosives. They deployed CHAMP, Counter-Electronics High-Power Microwave Advanced Missile Project Payloads. As the missiles flew over the Iranian command centers, they emitted bursts of high-energy microwaves. In a microsecond, the silicon chips in the Iranian computers, the circuits in their radios, and the motherboards of their missile controllers were turned into useless slag. There were no explosions, no fire, and no casualties, just a sudden, total technological blackout. Iran's military was suddenly deaf, dumb, and blind. Simultaneously, U.S. Navy SEALs and Marine Expeditionary Units, MEUs, from the USS Bataan moved to secure the Greater and Lesser Toomb Islands. These rocky outcrops were the eyes of the IRGC in the Strait. The engagement was brief and brutal. The Marines, using night vision and suppressed weapons, cleared the Iranian observation posts in 20 minutes. By dawn on May 17th, the U.S. had seized the high ground of the Strait, but the victory was hollow. As the sun rose over a burning Pacific glory, the global map had been redrawn. Russia had utilized the Middle Eastern chaos to press its advantage in Ukraine, launching a fresh offensive on Kupiansk. China had established a permanent maritime safety corridor in the Indian Ocean, effectively ending 80 years of unchallenged American naval hegemony. As of May 21, 2026, the ceasefire remains a fragile ghost. Iran's nuclear program is gone, but the regime in Tehran, now backed by Russian volunteers and Chinese credit, is more entrenched than ever. Israel remains in a state of total mobilization, its economy strained by the longest call-up of reservists in its history. The world in April 2026 is not standing at the edge of a cliff. It has already jumped. The B-21 raiders have returned to their hangars, but the engines of global conflict are still hot. The question for the next decade is not whether the war will happen. It is whether it will ever truly end. The clock is still running, the oil is still burning, and the midnight sun has only just begun to rise. Stay alert.